All right, hello guys. Welcome to the first of the recorded lectures. So these are going to be following the chapter readings, which are assigned in an updated schedule on Blackboard. Please take a look at that. Make sure you're reading along. I'm going to try to record these a little bit shorter than the normal kind of class time. So this will not be, obviously, you've seen the length of the video, this will not be a 2 hour long lecture as we would normally have during class. So I'm really hoping you guys are going to, at the very least, make sure that we're paying attention to the chapters in the book a little bit more. So again, please see the updated schedule on Blackboard. Let me know if you have any questions. There are going to be a couple chapters at the end of the book which we are going to be cutting. So we're going to get to chapter 12 and that'll be where we stop for this semester. If you guys have feedback about the recording quality, something that is annoying you that I can try to fix, please let me know. Again, this is the first one we're doing, so any feedback about this method of presenting the material to you, I'd love to hear, okay? So in previous weeks, we talked about the explosion of popularity which followed the development of the silver gelatin process, the gelatin dry plate process in the 1870s. This followed with flexible film, smaller cameras, and the standardization and industrialization of processes in chemistry. All of this meant that photography was much more accessible and it was easier to do. And when you had industrially made, commercially available photographic materials, chemistry, paper, dry plates, and later film, which would follow the dry plate, it meant that you could take photography everywhere and anywhere and then develop it later, right? So you could take your photographs from the top of a mountain, very far away from a darkroom. You could do a very long exposure in the case of astrophotography, right, which required very, very long exposures. You do these things and then take them back to the darkroom and develop them at any point after, right? This freed photographers from the portable darkroom, which wet plate collodion necessitated, and generally just having access to chemistry, right? Wet plate collodion was a very involved, intricate, easily messed up process. Gelatin dry plate, right? They could be mass produced. So plates could be mass produced. You could buy packs of them. You could buy packs of paper. It meant that it was much easier to get into photography. And many people were introduced to photography through this camera we're looking at here, which is the Kodak #1. And basically it was promoted as you take the picture, we do the rest. It launched the photo processing industry, which really didn't exist prior to it, right? Its accessibility meant that even a child could do photography. And this obviously brought many people to photography that hadn't done it previously. And once they were hooked, there was, of course, a variety of more complex, more expensive hand cameras, which were made and marketed to more serious amateur photographers. And here's some of the Kodak 1 material, advertising material. You push the button, we do the rest. Came preloaded with 100 frames, a roll of flexible film that had 100 images on it. You'd shoot it up, you'd send the whole camera back to them, and then they would send you your prints. Anybody could use it. Here's some example images. I showed all you guys this in previous lectures, but just to kind of reiterate. And then here would be one of your more advanced hand cameras, right? So this had controllable aperture and shutter speed, some amount of focusing ability, and obviously there would be much, much more. So by this time, commercial printing technology has also caught up to photography. In particular, there's newspaper printing, which uses a halftone screen, which is a matrix of little dots, which are able to simulate continuous tone. If you want to know what this looks like, get a newspaper and get a magnifying glass and look at the images, and you'll see the matrix of tiny dots, which recreate the continuous tone of a photograph. And this also meant that photographic imagery was much more prevalent, and the public was much more literate and aware of it in terms of visual culture. So in short, technology made photography easier to do. It made it more accessible to the general public. There was a growing awareness of photographic imagery through its use in the publication of daily events, social conditions, scientific phenomena. And generally, these trends helped drive the growing interest in camera images of all kinds. And this includes, of course, artistic camera images. So the dramatic expansion in the number of people doing photography, its acceptance as a hobby and a pastime, really encouraged many people to approach it specifically from a perspective of creative expression, right? If you're doing photography as a hobby and as a pastime, you're less concerned with documenting specific things or scientific images, right? So a creative expression becomes more of a possibility as more and more people are doing it. So the technology, the changes of technology, the systematic kind of industrialization and commercial availability of photography cameras, photographic materials, the chemistry, all of these things make it easier to do. And more people do it, and more people become interested in it. More people become interested in art photography, right? Kind of makes sense. So we also discussed the first phase of art photography, referring more to mid-19th century, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s art photography, which was met with skepticism and qualified acceptance. And this is kind of illustrated by Nadar in his cartoons here, with photography asking for just a little place, the ingratitude of painting, and finally the qualified acceptance, right? Painting offers photography the smallest place. So photography was first seen as a technical process, right? It was kicked out of the exposition of Beaux-Arts, fine arts, beautiful arts. It was kicked out, and it was sent specifically to the science technology section of the famous exposition in 1857, right? It was relegated to the science section, right? So it was not allowed in the fine arts section of the Great Exposition in Paris. And it was because that photography did not allow for individuality of style, right? It could only reproduce and record. This is the early skepticism that I'm talking about. One that saw photography as something that could capture everything but said nothing. And for this reason, it was lesser than painting and drawing. However, the qualified acceptance, right, the smallest place, is that it's useful as an aid to art. And here is an example of the kind of salon where photography would not be allowed, right? But it was useful as an aid to art, as an aid for studying and making more realistic paintings. So as a study aid, which we looked at numerous examples of these, and also as an aid to reproduce art. Remember the Ingres painting here, which today time has damaged, but interestingly enough, the daguerreotype reproduction of it preserved the original look, which is kind of incredible. Right, so useful as an aid to art, useful as a tool to study and make better art, useful as a tool to document and publish and generally spread images of art outside of museums, but not an art form in itself. And so early art photographers appropriate many of the scenes and tableaux from the tradition of painting. And also use combination printing, which we'll look at in a second if you need a reminder, to create images which demonstrated that photography was capable of accommodating individual artistry. So we have Roger Fenton, who's kind of borrowing from the style of Romantic painting. And then you have Henry Peach Robinson borrowing from Millet, Ophelia from Shakespeare. So the use of kind of allegorical literary subject matter, scenes from the everyday, genre painting, using very similar scenes, drawing from still life. These are kind of examples of the hunting still life. That's the bolt of a crossbow. A little bit more modern, we have the rifle. You can see that this is a carbon print, and we'll talk more about these other non-silver printing techniques, which Pictorialism favored heavily, which gave a wider range of texture and tone. And then combination printing with Gustave Le Gray. So this was a collodion negative. He printed in skies, which certainly make his images far more dramatic and artful than a lot of the other collodion images that we've seen, which have the blown out sky, right? The pure white sky. Rehinder's, Oscar Rehinder's Two Ways of Life, obviously alluded to Raphael's School of Athens, but also used combination printing to assemble this tableau of the choice between, we'll say, more evil pursuits and more pious pursuits. Robinson's combination printing, which we looked at. And so going back to some of these earlier art photographers like Julia Margaret Cameron, Rehinder, Robinson, this being Robinson, this being Rehinder, right? They're kind of often lumped together for both using combination printing, but they are obviously separate people. So Margaret Cameron, Rehinder, Robinson, a lot of these early art photographers are also often referred to as pictorial photographers. The timing of their work and the styles kind of overlap with pictorialism, and Henry Peach Robinson actually coined the term pictorialism in his 1869 text, Pictorial Effect in Photography, and he often advocated for photography as an art form in his other texts as well as pictorial effect. So this is really the start of pictorial photography, and thematically many of these trends will continue. You'll see a lot of similar subject matter, a lot of continuing use of story, narrative, allegorical subject, classic subject. We'll see Shakespeare, we'll see more Greek influence, right? But there is a shift in approach which occurs in the 1890s and early 1900s. It continues to draw on the tradition of painting to affirm photography's status as an art form, but the treatment of subject matter and the technical approach are different. And the images are part of a much more cohesive push, deliberate cohesive push to establish photography as a fine art form. And it's really the force and direction of this ideology alongside the organization of photographic societies, which are dedicated solely to art photography. We talked about them a little bit, as well as the extensive use of darkroom techniques. So this is kind of taking combination printing and pushing it a little bit further in order to infuse unique, singular photographic prints with qualities that are recognized as artful. And these are the trends that I associate more with pictorialism, and they kind of come a little bit later, right, in the 1890s and 1900s. So there's several trends happening with pictorialism. We're going to look specifically at a few major components associated with the evolution of art photography happening at the turn of the century. And those components are going to be the influence of Emerson's concept of naturalism, the treatment of the photographic print as a unique object, and finally, the organization and promotion of art photography through photographic societies and what they kind of bring to this evolution. So the first that we'll talk about is naturalism. And in terms of the treatment of subject matter, there is a move from the kind of staged and controlled scene, which felt increasingly contrived, right? And remember that Reyhinder and Robinson's work, their combination printing, was largely viewed as a failure, right? School of Athens was entered into a jury art show to stand alongside painting, and it did not fare well, right? These did not read well alongside their counterparts in painting. So beginning in the 1890s, maybe a little bit earlier, there's a shift from this contrived, staged, controlled subject matter to more realistic, natural feeling compositions. So this is F. Holland Day. It's a scene of the crucifixion. Obviously, there is a familiar anecdotal scene being shown here, but it's reproduced in a more naturalized manner, right? This feels a little bit less staged, but you can hopefully still kind of see the end of the road in terms of recycling this contrived, melodramatic, right? Very, very dramatically overcooked subject matter. So we also have, with this example here, George Davidson, Onion Field, that looking at art photography near 1900 compared to the genre images that we looked at earlier, there is much more interest in pure kind of natural landscape. And notice the quality of detail is a little bit different from previous landscapes, which were much more about realism, much more about transcribing the whatever the scene was onto the photograph. This is a little bit more impressionist, right? There's a texture, there's a gradient in tonality. You can see the texture of the paper there. There's a softness, a subtlety to it that doesn't necessarily exist in landscape that we looked at from previous kind of classes. If we think about landscape from the Crimean War, landscape from the Civil War, landscape from carte de visites made in Greece, in Rome, in Egypt, in the Holy Land, right? Quite different from the tonality, the subtlety, the texture and quality of this image here. And even when familiar subject matter, right, here we have these kind of idealized types, it's treated much more naturally in regard to posing and staging, right? So this shift is in part due to Peter Henry Emerson's concept of naturalism. So Emerson was a British writer and photographer. There he is on the left, that's Emerson. This is one of his images on the right. And in 1889, he writes a book called Naturalistic Photography for Students of the Art, which was forward-thinking in a number of different ways and would influence not only pictorial photography at the time, but the movement that's going to follow pictorialism, which is namely going to be straight photography, generally referred to as straight photography. So naturalism is almost like a reaction to the contrived feel of early art photographs. It's a response to Robinson's pictorial effect in photography particularly, And Emerson really held that the camera and all visual art should reflect the nature of things. It should reflect them with a truth of sentiment. And that's kind of looking at things as they naturally appear, as they make us feel. And this is very different from realism. The approach is to interpret and respond to the impression of things on you, of nature on you as a photographer, versus attempting to transcribe and kind of define nature. Hopefully this makes sense to you guys. Emerson associated photography with the act of seeing. He believed that a photograph should be a true representation of what the eye saw. So that's really important, a true representation of what the eye saw, the eye, not the way the thing is in actuality, the way that it appears to us, the impression of nature upon us. So he printed his work without retouching or any darkroom trickery of any kind, which we'll talk about, which was heavily favored by pictorialism and pictorial photographers. He really did not like that retouching because it obscured that which the eye saw, right? It obscured the quality of sight that photography offers. So you can kind of start to see the modern looking critique of photography already. And we talked about Clement Greenberg's modernist painting, and we kind of use that as a framework to think about photography as a unique and separate medium. You can see where he's starting to equate photography with the act of seeing. You can see where he's starting to equate that idea with his text earlier, right? And Emerson's ideas, as expressed here, are closely linked to Impressionism. He really suggests that naturalism and Impressionism are synonymous terms. He's using naturalism specifically to refer to photography and other graphic art, whereas Impressionism obviously refers more to painting. And it's really about painting or rendering something as it makes us feel, rather than just trying to replicate its physical appearance. And hopefully the difference between those two makes sense to you guys. Despite Emerson's approach to retouching, which is you shouldn't do it, you'll likely see similarity between Impressionist painting style and pictorialist photographs. There's also a romantic, even transcendental influence when we think about camera images which engage feelings and senses, the importance of what the photographer felt when he saw the photograph moment, allowing nature to work through the camera. We can start to see these influences, right? So, as I've kind of already hinted at, Emerson's criticism of pictorial photography already signals the coming shift in art photography, as pictorialism is going to run its course and give way to what, as I already said, is generally referred to as the straight photography, or the straight photograph. And Edward Weston's Seeing Photographically, which is sort of a critical dialogue about straight photography, a manual for straight photography, was heavily influenced by Emerson's naturalistic photography. So here we can see a genre image, right? An image from the everyday, but photographed in a way that feels a little bit more natural. Now, obviously, there's a sense of drama to the scene, right? That otherwise, a lot of the documentary, realistically rendered images that we looked at previously don't have this same level of drama. We saw this kind of with Fenton's work in Crimea, with some of O'Sullivan's work from the Civil War. People kind of learned that the images which read the best were the ones that had some sense of drama and force behind their composition, compared to the images which were static, coldly kind of informational images, right? Also notice the brush strokes here. You can see some brush strokes. You can see the texture of the paper. So there are some physical qualities which are present. And we're allowed to kind of see the individual hand of the artist, the individual sight of the artist. So we're going to talk more about these techniques in a second here. Gum bichromate being one of the most popular. You'll see it there. The azotype carbon print being another. So we already in the mid-1800s saw some attempts to accommodate artistic expression in photography, and that came in the form of combination printing from Rahinder Robinson Legray. By the 1890s, the push to regard photographs as being made by the hand in the same exact sense that paintings were was in full swing. And this is what pictorial photography is all about, being a direct counter to the prevalent attitude that photography can't duplicate that spiritual essence of a photographer's oeuvre, that je ne sais quoi, that certain something, the personal, human, emotional element, that secret sauce, which is emblematic of the old view of visual art and painting, right? So with pictorial photography, this magical essence is captured in the form of the unique print. So instead of creating exact copies from a negative, each print is treated as being one of a kind. Each print worked on physically through an expansive number of darkroom techniques to carefully control tonality and contrast, to add highlights and shadows, to obscure details which are too descriptive, right? To distance art photographs from realistic documentation and that style of photography. So these techniques involved physically altering the medium using fingers, stumps, pencils, brushes, etching, scraping, painterly techniques, which again distanced art photographs from coldly documentarian images. They allowed the hand of the artist, going back to Emerson, some measure of subjective emotional response to be visual in each print. So we can see the brushstrokes, we can see the scrape, we can see the fingerprints of the artist, and we can have some measure of emotional subjective response in each print. So with this image here, here's a retouched negative. You can see the brushstrokes, you can see the scrapes. So they used a variety of different papers and additional processes. You've probably seen in the bottom left there, platinum and gum bichromate, carbon printing, platinum printing. There's a lot of printing out processes that don't involve silver gelatin, which have softer mediums which hold light-sensitive material and allow brushes, pens, fingers to get in there and rub and alter them. So gum bichromate uses gum arabic, which is a binder for oil paints, uses that as a medium to hold light-sensitive material. It hardens proportionally to light, and it allows you to layer many different coatings of light-sensitive pigment on top of it, and it allows you to alter the surface of the print. Edward Steichen, who we'll talk about a little bit in detail, using gum bichromate and using layers of light-sensitive pigment to create a kind of color image, right? So the first color images, which there's a whole chapter of the book, which obviously occurs right around chapter 7, which shows the early color work. So pictorial photography brings with it the gum bichromate process, which was used for the many early color experiments. So I'm not going to go into super great detail talking about these processes more than what we've already kind of discussed, but really that they produce a wider range of different textures and tones. They were sometimes referred to as ennobling processes. Noble as in nobility, a level of dignity. They raised the level of photography because they allowed for more creative exploration, right? These techniques served as a means of greater expression, and they helped satisfy collectors who preferred rare or singular artifacts. And we see that trend continuing today. If you look at fine art photography, even digital prints of fine art photography, they're almost always done in series, 1 of 50, 10 of 20, right? They're almost always done in print series. So each series is only going to have a certain number of prints, which gives them some exclusivity, right? There's only 50 of this image printed, despite the fact that I could use my digital printer to reproduce 10,000 of the exact same image. I'm only going to print 50 to make them more rare, to make them more singular, to make them more attractive to art collectors. So the treatment of the unique print is very much partially there to satisfy the hand of the artist, the expression of the individual, the individuality of style, but it's also there to help satisfy art collectors who are more familiar and prefer rare or singular art objects, art artifacts, right? And as discussed in regard to Emerson, who, as we know, did not like the extensive retouching of pictorial photographs, that criticism is growing at this time, 1890s, 1900s, especially later towards the 1920s, when pictorialism is kind of running its course, right? But there is this criticism of pictorial photographs as being, quote unquote, fuzzy graphs, that if gone too far, the artistic handiwork, right, all of the retouching, the brushing, the blurring, produces images that aren't even recognizable as photographs. This idea that pictorialism abandoned the unique qualities of photography. So as the recycling of subject matter, which was happening in the 60s and 70s, the 1860s and 70s, that is, as that begins to feel stale by the turn of the century, it kind of gives way to the increasing use of the ennobling processes. As that got stale by the turn of the century, these similarly ennobling processes get stale by the 1920s. There's kind of a limit that you can get to by following the tradition of painting. And eventually that limit is exhausted and pictorialism kind of runs its course. So we're going to talk more about that when we kind of conclude it, but you can start to see where this more modern view of photography as a unique and separate, distinct medium comes into play, right? Photography, being separate from painting, cannot follow the traditional form of painting, or can only follow it so far. And at a certain point, you have to embrace the detail, embrace the real, embrace the thing itself, right? Going back to Sarkowski. And find the art in seeing photographically, to quote Edward Weston. These ideas you can already see stirring even in the 1890s and 1900s signal the coming of straight photography. So, the pictorial techniques, right? The painterly techniques, we talked about that. We talked about the influence of Emerson's naturalism. And now we're going to turn to pictorial societies and the photo secession. So we'll talk about some of the big groups, the major figures. There are many different groups, many different figures within the groups. This is a very small cross-section of some of the major European photo secession groups and some of their major players. So by the early 1890s, the older established photo societies, which I've talked about previously, right? Britain's Royal Academy of Photography. These were societies which were founded in the earlier era of photography, when photography was kind of undifferentiated, right? Documentary photography wasn't really differentiated from art photography. And science photography was seen as art photography, right? Duchamp and his painting being influenced by the motion studies being done by Muybridge, right? They were very much seen as the confluence of art and science. So these earlier societies don't really serve the needs of partisans whose aim is specifically to promote the camera as an art form, photography as an art form. And so artists that fell into this camp who wanted to specifically promote photography as an art form, as a fine art form, they organized a collection of loosely affiliated societies known as the secession movement or the photo secession. And that is secession in the same form as the South seceding from the North, right? And these groups included the Weimar Camera Club, the Vienna Camera Club. And you have Hugo Henneberg with his Italian villa, right? So again, Italian, the interest in classical form. And we saw similar landscapes to this in terms of their overall composition, but their tonality and the physical technique of producing them very different, right? This is much more painterly. It is much more distanced from coldly documentation, which we saw with a lot of the earlier kind of classical landscapes, right? Heinrich Kuhn, very painterly, right? It almost looks like a charcoal rubbing. Hans Watzik. So those are some of the people from Vienna. You also have the Linked Ring, which was founded by Henry Peach Robinson, and this is predominantly a British camera club. This is, I don't mention it here, I believe this is photogravure, which was a kind of almost printmaking technique, which produced obviously wonderful gradient, wonderful tonality in each print. Alvin Langdon Coburn, one of the major figures in the Linked Ring Brotherhood. Similarly, right, this is not too unfamiliar to our earlier landscape, but the treatment of it, the approach, technically entirely different. And then you have the Photo Club de Paris, Robert Demachet being one of the central figures in the Paris secession group. Here are more examples of his images. Dubreuil, very kind of romantic, obscuring details. And then the photo secession of New York, which was headed by Stieglitz. So I wanted to hopefully kind of give you some sense of the different techniques and styles, the kind of breadth of pictorial techniques in showing you these different styles. But generally you'll see there tends to be a focus on, well, a lack of focus rather on softening the details, right? So rather than have like that really sharp descriptive detail, pictorialism is, that's why they call them fuzzy graphs, right? There is very much kind of the reduction of photographic detail and an emphasis towards really kind of impressionist painting almost. But you can see where the criticism of Emerson and the calling of these fuzzy graphs, where they are kind of abandoning the quality of photography for the quality of painting, you can see where that criticism would start to get some traction, right? So these groups were joined by numerous, as I kind of already said, numerous smaller amateur photographic societies, and together, collectively, they create a forum for exchanging information and ideas regarding aesthetic concept, technical processes, as well as spaces for exhibition and publication of photographic work. So, collectively as a group, along with other numerous smaller groups, you can see where they're kind of pushing, right? And another thing that's kind of interesting is a lot of these groups would feature work of other people from other groups. So there is a dialogue and there's a back and forth. Coburn's work was shown in Camera Work, which was the Photo Secession publication. So they showed each other's work. They had exhibitions that featured the work from other shows. These clubs were not happening in a vacuum. They were very much in dialogue with one another, right? And Stieglitz and the Photo Secession of New York is kind of they're a particularly important group, and Stieglitz is a really towering figure in turn of the century photography. I will share a documentary, Stieglitz documentary, where he talks about the steerage photo. This is one of his most famous images, and he really, you could see it as a documentary image almost, right? Documenting the plight of these people who are in the steerage of the boat, the lower class boat passengers. But he doesn't describe this photo that way at all. He describes it as a photograph made of shapes, and the breaking of this frame into different pieces, the composition. He, seeing qualities of the real in a purely visual way, the circle of the man's hat. It's really kind of a watershed moment for Stieglitz, and it kind of marks that idea of seeing visually, seeing photographically, seeing shape. Really it kind of marks the shift from the use of pictorial techniques, painterly techniques, the tradition of painting. It marks the difference between that approach to art photography and the new approach to art photography, being seeing photographically, seeing visually, seeing in regard to shape and form, almost abstract, that is kind of coming. So a little bit about Stieglitz and this image, the steerage there. You have Steichen, who is always kind of in Stieglitz's shadow, although who contributed massively to it. Very romantic landscape, right? Very dark, very brooding. The term being chiaroscuro, when referring to light and dark, this moonrise. Clarence White, very kind of similar in style, this idealized kind of type portrait, the wood nymph, if you like, holding a bubble there. Gudrid Casimir, one of the female members of the Photo Secession. So this is just, each one of these people has an incredible body of work. This is really just a very, very brief cross-section. You could have entire lectures talking about Steichen's work, especially Stieglitz's work. I mean, any of these people, Clarence White becomes an important figure in the next movements of photography in the Clarence White School of Photography. Each one of these people really deserves much more time discussing their careers, but obviously we're just going to give you a cross-section and kind of give you the broad strokes. So besides sponsoring their own work and promoting their own work through galleries, the most famous being Stieglitz's 291, the Photosecession Gallery, they attempted to interest galleries, museums, and fine art academies. So they really pushed this work into proper galleries, proper museums, and fine art academies. They really pushed. And part of that push came from periodicals and books, which were focused solely on promoting the art of photography. And camera notes and camera work are kind of the most the most famous. As a motorcycle drives by my house. So camera notes kind of came first and was followed by camera work, which was really the Photosecession of New York, right? This was the Camera Club of New York, and from that camera club came the Photosecession of New York, who promoted camera work. And Edward Steichen actually designed the logo for camera work. Stieglitz published both of these. So through camera work, the New York Photosecession introduced a level of cohesiveness and direction to the pictorialist photography movement. It really, when we talk about the directness of the ideology, it really comes from camera work and Stieglitz and the Photosecession groups. And I mean that collectively, not just in regard to the group in New York, but globally. And we'll see if we look here, you can see New York Photosecession people alongside Linked Ring people, alongside the Paris Club people, right? The Photosecession of Paris. So they showed each other's work, they promoted each other's work. It was really meant to compel the seriousness in recognizing photography as an additional medium of pictorial expression. So it was published between 1904 and 1917. It was known for having images of the highest quality, and these would have been published alongside articles on technique, as well as critical writing. So here they're writing about earlier photography. They're talking about Julia Margaret Cameron, Herschel Tennyson being the guy who brought poetry surrounding King Arthur. He was Margaret Cameron's neighbor, if you remember. Hill and Adamson's work they like to talk about, right? So talking about some of the earlier art photography. This is one example, obviously, of many. And really, so Stieglitz published and edited camera work. And the direction and the role of camera work in the Photosecession, in the pictorial photography movement, is really part of what made Stieglitz such a towering figure in pictorial art photography, early 20th century art photography. He became the authority figure of photography in this era, and really kind of the following era in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. He really became an important figure in photography and in modern art as well. In addition to publishing camera work, he organized and judged juried shows. He presided over the gallery at 291, which was the Photosecession Gallery. There's a picture of it. And as I said, he became one of the major authority figures of photography. And there's a whole, you could, again, I'll share the documentary with you guys about Stieglitz. He's one of those larger than life figures from photography that we kind of talked about before, alongside Nadar and some of these other guys that just kind of did it all. So here's an example. This is Stieglitz in the little gallery of 291, as it was kind of called. And here's how they would show some of the photographs. A little bit different from the hanging of salon images, right? And we have kind of a breakthrough moment, a culminating moment for pictorialism in 1910, when the Albright Gallery, right here in Buffalo, buys 15 photographs from Stieglitz's 291 gallery. And this is the first time that photography is exhibited in a major museum, in a major gallery. It's the first time that photography is officially recognized as an art form worthy of a museum collection, right? So Albright buys these images to add them to the museum collection. And they're still in the museum collection, although Albright Knox never really shows them, much to my chagrin. So this is a culminating moment. And by the 1920s, pictorialism is already running out of steam, right? So there was criticism of the technique, right? Of these kind of painterly techniques. That criticism existed, very early in the movement. We're looking at 1900s stuff, and pictorialism would kind of continue into the 1920s. But in many cases, sorry for my loud keyboard, in many cases, it's achieved its aim. So by 1910, by 1920, photography has now been recognized by some major museums. It's now being collected by serious art collectors, by museums and galleries, right? It's kind of achieved its aim. It's now able to be seen, still not quite, and still not today, as an art form on par with drawing and painting. But it's seen as an art form, right? We can now see that there's individuality of style. It's recognized, particularly at the time. You have to remember, right, we are looking back with the benefit of all of our understanding of photography today. Remember what they're up against at the time, and the early criticism, the early skepticism that we talked about in regard to photography, right? So photography is really, it's now seen as possible as an art form, right? So it's achieved its aim, and with the European art scene fractured in the aftermath of World War I, and this painterly style, right, already being criticized when it's happening, all of it kind of grows stale. And as I said, it's running out of steam by the 1920s. Stieglitz increasingly moves away from photography and instead exhibits work of European modernist painting. And this isn't European, this is Georgia O'Keeffe, who would become Stieglitz's girlfriend. There's a whole other presentation to be had where we talk about Stieglitz's relationships with women. But in any case, right, Stieglitz increasingly moves away from photography and exhibits more work of modernist painting. And 291 is really one of the first places that brings European modernist painting. These are European paintings here. I believe this is, I want to say Kandinsky, but I'm not sure. I forget the name of this artist. These are very famous Bauhaus paintings. And Bauhaus was the German school of design, which came really into form in the 1920s before being run out of Germany by the Nazis. So again, we're shifting towards modern art, modern painting. This shift is present in Stieglitz's own photography as he moves to more modern subject matter, cityscapes, the flat iron being a very iconic symbol of modernism in New York City. And eventually he moves to almost abstract, conceptualized photographs of the sky and clouds, which he refers to as the equivalents. He did a whole series of images that were just focused on the sky and clouds, suggesting that they are equivalent for something else. So it's a conceptual photograph. So this is the last slide I have. We'll just kind of summarize the presentation here. By 1920, the vitality and influence of pictorialism has expired. The photosecession movement, the forcefulness of it has really gone away. It kind of exhausted itself following the tradition of painting, right? The movement had run its course. It gave way to shifting ideas surrounding photography, becoming straight photographers, right? And was influenced by Emerson's naturalistic photography. And these straight photographies, the coming straight photographers, renounce pictorialism as a mistake, as a dead end. As Edward Weston put it, the folly of using a camera to make a painting. Weston saw pictorialism as being incompatible with the logic of the camera. So this is where the criticism comes that it's a dead end or it's a mistake. This is really the idea that it comes from, right? That following the tradition of painting is incompatible with the logic of the camera, right? It doesn't contain that sort of modern view of photography as a separate and unique art form that it is, that we see it today as, right? So despite these criticisms, pictorialism and the photosecession are really the instruments that demonstrate that it's possible to have a level of personal expression and individual style in a photograph. And at that point, this had not been recognized as possible in photography, right? We talked about the early skepticism surrounding photography as an art form, right? This was not really acknowledged and recognized in photography until pictorialism and the photosecession groups pushed it through. So the forcefulness of pictorialism, of the photosecession as a body of work, the seriousness of its purpose, the discussion surrounding the unique qualities of photography as a medium, all of which were made in a partially successful attempt to erase the division between traditional art and photography, produced a number of concepts which we've talked about that are still relevant and engage photographers today. So partially successful, right? Photography is still not really, if you look at within the high art, the fine art world, photography is not sold for the same amount. Photographs are not collected. They're not sold for the same amounts that paintings and drawings are. And, there's a number of obvious kind of reasons behind that surrounding mass reproduction, right? Mechanical reproduced objects, but this is why I say partially successful. So that's where we're going to leave it for today with chapter 7. Hopefully hearing my voice and having me talk through these presentations is preferable to you guys than reading a summary of notes from me. I felt like this was the most natural way to kind of continue the style of class that we've been doing up until this point. So again, this really has to be supplanted with material from the book. So continue to read the book. If you haven't been reading the book, you need to really start reading the book, because there's going to be a little bit less material from a lecture standpoint coming at you. So if anybody has feedback, if you guys have feelings about this style of work, if there's criticism, if there's something I can do better for you, I want to do it better. I want to hear from you, please. If you have not joined the group Discord, please get on the group Discord. I would love to see more discussion more back and forth coming on there. So I will be sharing some kind of Google form quiz. It's only going to be a couple of sentences that proves to me that you listened to this, that you paid attention, that you read the chapter due for this week. Basically going to stand in for participation and attendance moving forward. So making sure that you're keeping up with the course material. So there'll be one of them a week. There'll be one of these lectures a week moving forward till the end of the semester. And other than that, I've presented you guys all of the course material. So the midterm is up on Blackboard. This is going to be up on Blackboard as soon as I post it on Blackboard. And obviously, the parts of the paper have been shared on Blackboard. So please get into that stuff. There are deadlines posted. Everything has been shared. Please get into that stuff as soon as you can, particularly the paper. There's going to be some group components to that. There's going to be some parts that I want to have the opportunity to give you feedback on before you start writing your paper. So take a look at that. And again, join the Discord. Ping me if you have questions on the Discord. That's probably the quickest place to get answers from me if something isn't clear or you need clarification about an assignment and so on. So again, hopefully this works for you guys moving forward. It's a little bit weird to be talking into a wall and looking at my computer screen rather than, kind of talking and getting feedback visually as the lecture is going. If I need to move on, if something is being, a little bit too repetitive in terms of information and so on. So I hope this works for you guys. It's certainly more work than posting the notes. And, I felt like it was important to have some kind of continuous tone, which carried over from the way the class was conducted in person. So again, let me know. I want to know your feedback. I want to hear from you guys. And I guess until next week, I will communicate with you through Discord and online. Take care, guys.